Have you ever found yourself turning away or shielding your eyes just before something scary happens on screen? Or perhaps you're the type who watches intently, absorbing every detail, even if it means feeling that deep-seated fear. It's fascinating how we can feel afraid, even when nothing has actually happened yet, simply by anticipating what might come next. Picture this. You're walking down a dark alley at night, and your brain starts warning you that this might not be a good idea. It's amazing how our minds can pick up on potential dangers, but this very sensitivity can also be manipulated to instill fear. Horror comes in many forms: movies, games, books, and sometimes even audio experiences. Ever since scary media became popular, creators have been exploring new ways to frighten us. For instance, classic movies like Psycho and The Exorcist set the bar high with their psychological tension and shocking moments. In gaming, titles like Silent Hill and Resident Evil have become iconic for their immersive atmospheres and terrifying gameplay. Even books like Stephen King's It and Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House have proven that the written word can invoke just as much fear as visual media. Some creators figure out the secret to effective horror and understand it much better than anyone else. The question is, will we ever run out of new ideas on how to scare ourselves? Could this be why most people consider the best scary media to be the older ones? Have we exhausted all the possibilities for creating truly terrifying ways of portraying horror? The art of creating horror lies not with the final reveal, but with the roller coaster of emotions we experience until that moment. This is where quality over quantity matters so much more than you might think. Many modern examples of horror aim to get the job done with a short build-up followed by a jump scare, but you'll often find yourself less eager to revisit them once you know the scare. Instead, you find yourself drawn back to experiences that made you feel uneasy, even if the final reveal wasn't as terrifying as it seemed. Quick jump scares can be more annoying than genuinely frightening. Even if a toaster startles you, it won't linger in your mind as much as an inanimate object with an unknown dark history behind it. Your brain tries to fill in the gaps, causing you to add to your own fear. Horror games are one of the closest things you get to a truly terrifying experience. As the protagonist, your fate is determined by the choices you make. Many argue that older games were scarier, and while this might be partly true, it's not for the reasons people often think. Poor graphics only added a minor element of horror to the game. Here's an example of a great modern horror game with realistic graphics. Here's another one, and another one. Now here are a few modern horror games with not so realistic graphics. They're just as scary as older titles like Silent Hill and the classic Resident Evil series, which have proven themselves time and time again by offering superior experiences. A scary game's success is not in how quickly it frightens the player, but rather in the emotional toll it takes. The things that make the player anxious are the surroundings, the noises, their limitations as a player, and their fear of the unknown. Creating an atmosphere is one of the most important things in a horror game. The suspense that results from all of this building towards the big reveal comes from our own minds trying so hard to fill in the blanks that we wind up overanalyzing situations that we never meant to be in the first place. Look at these scenes from a few Resident Evil games and notice the ambiance and atmosphere. Notice how everything is so still, and the only thing you can hear is the surrounding noise and the soundtrack. Resident Evil 1's horror lies within what happened in the mansion before the player got there, and what was lurking around every corner. Another example is Silent Hill. You can't see much around you, but at times you can hear something lurking in the dark or the fog. Silent Hill's horror lies within the town where nothing made sense because it was a manifestation of the protagonist's psychological issues. There are quite a few modern games that do manage to follow this formula, and it works just as reliably as it did in the old games. Resident Evil 7 puts you in the shoes of an average person, going up against an unstoppable force while being confined to extremely small environments. PT was universally loved by fans because of its simplicity around this principle. You were stuck in an endless loop, walking through the same hall, but every time you looped around, there was a gradual change. This made you fear what was waiting for you the next time you came around. This is the reason found footage-style horror gained so much popularity. You never are able to tell entirely what is going on, which is where the fear of the unknown is seen in use again. Information is slowly relayed in bits and pieces until we put all the pieces together. Many people understand this principle and, when given the chance, are able to articulate that fear through their works, which is why most genuinely scary games nowadays are indie games. Those games aren't made to sell millions of copies, but to scare the player and actually deliver on the promise of horror. Successful horror movies aren't very different in terms of building suspense and not revealing everything too soon. There is always a relatively calm part that has more to do with the horror than the actual scare itself. It doesn't even have to be a horror movie. It could be a thriller, but as long as it still follows the same principle, it still puts you on edge. Sometimes, if done well, a scene doesn't even need a soundtrack, and the silence becomes deafening. The louder and flashier a movie gets, the farther it gets from a true horror experience. Just like indie games, there are several successful short horror films that get everything pretty much right. Even books have the potential to scare the reader, despite being just words on a piece of paper. Our mind is where all the magic happens. Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park was originally a horror novel, and for anyone who has read it, knows of all the gruesome scenes in it. Horror stories have gained a lot of popularity, and for good reason. A well-written or narrated horror story can create a vivid picture in the reader's or listener's mind about the situation. They can vary widely, from fictional works of unnatural encounters to true crime. The lore surrounding the story gives it much more depth, raising many more questions. Fictional stories can be scary because of all the minute details and the ability to go beyond our physical limitations. Works of fiction can be molded specifically to create something that has the highest chances of scaring the most people. True horror stories are frightening because their inherent danger lies in their reality. They're scary because they're true. That means whatever happened in the story can happen to anyone, even you. This can be unbearable for some, but extremely addictive for others. The roller coaster ride of emotions is what sells horror because it always keeps the audience on edge. Sometimes, it's even scarier when events are left unresolved and unexplained at the end. There's something about unsolved events that makes the viewer feel uneasy. The idea that the world has forgotten about something, and the possibility that if it were to happen again, would it still go unsolved? So we see this commonality between all good works of horror. Movies allow the viewer to sit back and let the suspense build, as the audience has no control over the unfolding events. What happens, happens. In video games, the audience is compelled to actively participate and endure the entire journey, facing whatever awaits them at the end. Audio stories and books rely on the listener's or reader's imagination to paint the scene. They can intricately deliver a vivid and comprehensive picture of the situation being described. When done well, all these forms of media share common elements that make them truly effective at conveying horror. It's the combination of a masterfully crafted atmosphere that builds suspense, mixed with the limitations the audience has. Together, it causes the brain to become your own worst enemy. The most effective horror taps into our fear of the unknown, using atmosphere and suspense to create an enduring sense of dread. Whether it's a movie, game, or book, the best horror experiences make us confront our deepest fears by playing with our imagination. Dread is sown in your mind by the persistent need to live up to the expectations of something you cannot control.